On the morning of August 15, 1893, a frantic telegram arrived at the Newport Police Department, setting in motion one of the Gilded Age's most deeply unsettling unsolved mysteries. Evangeline Cunningham, a 23-year-old heiress to a railroad fortune exceeding $40 million, had vanished without a single trace from her family's oceanfront mansion during the most prestigious social gathering of the Newport season. What made the circumstances of her disappearance truly chilling wasn't simply that she was gone. It was what investigators uncovered hidden within her private chambers. Detailed photographs of 13 prominent Newport families, each marked with cryptic symbols. A leather-bound journal packed with names, dates, and dollar amounts that implicated some of the most powerful industrialists in America within a sprawling web of blackmail and murder stretching back across decades. And most disturbing of all, a collection of forged death certificates bearing the signatures of 3 separate coroners, each one documenting deaths that had been officially ruled accidental, yet all displaying identical symptoms of arsenic poisoning. For more than a century, the Cunningham family wielded their influence to keep these discoveries buried, insisting that Evangeline had perished in a tragic accident overseas. Federal investigators who tried to examine the evidence found their access mysteriously blocked by court orders signed by judges with direct financial ties to the very railroad interests Evangeline had been probing. Local newspaper editors who initially showed curiosity about the story abruptly reversed course after receiving visits from well-dressed men who spoke quietly of unfortunate consequences awaiting those who chose to spread malicious rumors about respected citizens. But recently uncovered court documents and witness testimonies paint a far more sinister portrait of that August night in 1893. A cache of letters discovered within the walls of a demolished Providence mansion reveals that Evangeline had been collaborating with a network of private investigators, foreign journalists, and even federal agents who were covertly documenting what they called the American Conspiracy. A systematic campaign of murder and corruption that extended into the uppermost levels of government and business. Before we continue unraveling the story of Evangeline Cunningham and the dark secrets that may have ultimately cost her life, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments which state or city you're listening from. We love hearing from our community of mystery lovers who help us bring these buried truths to light. Tonight, we'll be presenting evidence suggesting that Evangeline's disappearance was no isolated incident, but part of a deliberate pattern of eliminations that claimed the lives of no fewer than 37 individuals who threatened to expose what contemporary documents referred to as the Newport Compact, a secret alliance among America's wealthiest families who had carved the nation's resources among themselves and stood ready to kill anyone who dared challenge their authority. Newport in the summer of 1893 stood as the undisputed crown jewel of American high society. Yet beneath its glittering surface ran a dark current of secrets, rivalries, and barely contained violence that would have profoundly shocked the American public, had they ever known the full truth. The coastal Rhode Island town had undergone a dramatic transformation from a modest colonial settlement into what newspapers enthusiastically called America's Monte Carlo, a playground where railroad barons, steel magnates, and shipping dynasties competed fiercely to outshine one another with displays of staggering, unprecedented wealth. The celebrated Bellevue Avenue had evolved into a grand procession of marble palaces disguised as summer cottages, each more extravagant than the one before it, their construction having claimed the lives of dozens of immigrant workers whose deaths were seldom recorded or investigated. The metamorphosis of Newport into this gilded paradise had been carefully engineered by a tight-knit group of families who understood that concentrated wealth required not merely business savvy, but also sophisticated methods of social control. They had absorbed the hard lessons of the labor unrest and political challenges of the 1870s and 1880s, recognizing that public opinion could be genuinely hazardous to their interests. Newport represented their answer, a sealed community where they could map out business strategies, arrange marriages between their children, and coordinate responses to threats without any fear of outside interference. Within this rarefied world, the Cunningham family occupied a position of exceptional prominence. Harrison Cunningham had constructed his empire through the Baltimore and Newport Railroad, a vast network linking the major industrial centers of the Northeast and serving as an essential artery for the movement of coal, steel, and manufactured goods. By 1893, his personal wealth was estimated at over $40 million, the equivalent of more than $1 billion in today's money. Yet this figure reflected only his acknowledged holdings. Private banking records that would remain undiscovered until the 1970s revealed that Cunningham quietly controlled shadow companies worth at least another $20 million, encompassing mining operations in Colorado, timber enterprises in the Pacific Northwest, and shipping firms that deliberately operated under foreign flags to evade American labor laws. The family's Newport estate, Windward Hall, sat majestically upon a 12-acre bluff commanding sweeping views of the Atlantic. Its 68 rooms were filled to overflowing with treasures gathered from across Europe. Yet the mansion harbored features that very few guests ever laid eyes upon: a private telegraph office connected directly to railroad dispatch centers, a document vault with walls thick enough to resist dynamite, and a network of underground tunnels linking it to similar facilities at neighboring estates. These features spoke plainly to the reality that Newport's social season was at least as much about coordinating business conspiracies as it was about polished entertainment. But it was Harrison's daughter, Evangeline, who both captivated Newport society and simultaneously represented its most dangerous internal threat. Described by those who knew her as possessing an almost otherworldly, ethereal beauty, she had returned from 3 years at European finishing schools armed with an education that far surpassed what was considered appropriate for young women of her social standing. She spoke 4 languages with complete fluency, had studied philosophy and literature at the Sorbonne, and possessed what her governess tactfully described as an uncomfortably inquisitive mind. More troublingly for her family's interests, she had also received instruction in accounting, business law, and investigative techniques from professors who had no inkling they were equipping someone who would employ these very skills to threaten the entire architecture of American corporate power. At just 23 years old, Evangeline had already declined marriage proposals from 2 European counts and the son of a Pennsylvania steel magnate, much to her parents' mounting frustration. But her rejections were rooted not in romantic preference. They grew from her discovery that each of these suitors had been deliberately chosen because their families were complicit in the same web of corruption that underpinned her father's business empire. Through careful, methodical investigation, she had established that the European counts were representatives of banking interests that laundered profits extracted from American industrial accidents, while the steel magnate's son bore personal responsibility for the deaths of more than 40 workers in a series of entirely preventable mine collapses. The summer of 1893 had proven particularly tense for the Cunningham family, and indeed for all of Newport's elite. Harrison's health was in marked decline, though few yet understood that his symptoms bore a striking resemblance to those of other business leaders who had begun to question the methods of the Newport Compact. Questions about the railroad's succession had started to surface among business partners and rivals alike, particularly given that several recent accidents had conveniently eliminated potential challengers to Cunningham's grip on key transportation routes. Evangeline, as the sole heir, stood to inherit everything, but only on the condition that she married before her 25th birthday, as stipulated in the terms of her grandfather's will. This legal requirement had generated a pervasive sense of urgency that colored every social gathering that season, yet it had simultaneously handed Evangeline a powerful bargaining chip. She had quietly signaled to her parents' business associates that her willingness to comply with the marriage requirement might well depend upon receiving satisfactory explanations for certain questions she had about the family's business activities. The broader national context of 1893 added yet another layer of complexity to Newport's already intricate social dynamics. The entire country was reeling from the panic of 1893, a severe economic depression that had erupted that spring when the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad Company collapsed, setting off a cascade of bank failures and business bankruptcies. While Newport's wealthy residents appeared largely cushioned from the financial devastation, many fortunes were quietly crumbling, and several prominent families had been quietly forced to sell their mansions or retreat to more modest quarters, though they maintained their public facades of prosperity with rigid determination. What the general public never knew was that the Panic of 1893 had been deliberately engineered by the Newport Compact as a mechanism for consolidating their dominance over American industry. By manipulating credit markets and triggering carefully selected bankruptcies, they had managed to acquire competitors' assets at a fraction of their true value, while their own wealth remained insulated through foreign bank accounts and an elaborate web of shell companies. Against this backdrop of manufactured crisis and concealed desperation, Evangeline Cunningham's vast pending inheritance had taken on an almost mythical quality in Newport's social circles. The psychological atmosphere was further complicated by the presence of numerous European visitors who had come not purely for social reasons, but as representatives of banking and industrial interests intent on establishing footholds in the American economy. Many of these visitors were startled by the degree of violence and intimidation they encountered among America's business elite. Count Friedrich von Stauffen, a German banker who attended several Newport social events that summer, recorded in his private diary, The Americans speak freely of business competition, but what I witness here more closely resembles medieval warfare conducted with modern instruments. These people have organized themselves into feudal domains, each defending its territory through methods that would shock even the most ruthless European industrialists. The Count's observations proved particularly perceptive, as he had witnessed several incidents that other guests either overlooked entirely or chose to quietly ignore. During a garden party at the Pemberton estate, he had observed Theodore Pemberton engaged in a heated exchange with a man who appeared to be a federal government official. The conversation concluded with Pemberton handing the official a leather briefcase, after which the official departed immediately without joining the social festivities. When von Stauffen discreetly inquired about the encounter, he was informed that such exchanges were routine business matters of no concern to social guests. The evening of August 14, 1893 began much like countless other entries on Newport's packed social calendar, yet contemporary accounts suggest that many of those present sensed they were attending what might well be the final act of a drama that had been building for months. The Cunninghams were hosting their annual Summer's End Ball, a tradition that had become one of the season's most coveted invitations, and a gathering that served multiple purposes well beyond mere social entertainment. More than 300 guests had been invited to Windward Hall, representing not only the cream of American and European society, but also a carefully curated selection of politicians, judges, journalists, and business leaders whose cooperation was essential to sustaining the Newport Compact's iron grip over American commerce. The mansion blazed with electric lights, still a remarkable novelty in 1893 and a powerful display of technological sophistication that very few private residences could match. The electrical system had been installed not merely for illumination, but to power a private telephone exchange that kept the Cunningham family in instant contact with railroad dispatch centers, stock exchanges, and telegraph offices across the nation. Chinese lanterns bathed the terraced gardens in warm light as they cascaded down toward the ocean. Hidden among the decorative illumination, however, were calcium lights capable of instantly flooding the entire estate grounds with harsh brightness should any security concerns arise. The guest list for that evening laid bare the true nature of Newport's social structure. Among those present were Senator Marcus Hall of Pennsylvania, who had consistently opposed railroad safety legislation, Judge Cornelius Wetherbe of the Rhode Island Supreme Court, who had systematically dismissed lawsuits filed against industrial companies, and Dr. Edmund Sheffield, the state medical examiner, whose death certificates had enabled dozens of industrial fatalities to be classified as acts of God rather than corporate negligence. Also in attendance were 3 foreign diplomats whose governments had been quietly pursuing trade agreements that would grant American corporations preferential access to overseas markets in exchange for substantial private payments to European officials. Evangeline appeared that evening in a gown of pale blue silk, wearing the celebrated Cunningham sapphires, a necklace worth more than most people would earn across several lifetimes, yet one that also concealed a hidden compartment containing some of her most damaging pieces of evidence against the Newport Compact. Those who spoke with her that night later recalled that she seemed unusually animated, almost excited, though several guests detected an undercurrent of tension in her manner suggesting she was poised for some decisive and irreversible action. Mrs. Eleanora Sedgwick, wife of a Boston banking magnate who had herself been probing irregularities in railroad financing, would later tell investigators that Evangeline had drawn her aside during the opening waltz, whispering urgently, "Eleanora, if anything should happen to me tonight, remember that you saw me speaking with Theodore Pemberton near the conservatory. Remember the time precisely, it was exactly 9:15. But more importantly, remember that I gave you this." At that moment, Evangeline pressed a small key into Mrs. Sedgwick's gloved hand, adding, "Post Office Box 247 in Providence. The combination is my birthday reversed. Whatever you find there, make certain it reaches the Boston Herald and the New York World simultaneously." Theodore Pemberton was a 34-year-old heir to a Pittsburgh steel fortune and one of Evangeline's most relentless suitors, though his interest in marriage was driven entirely by business calculation rather than any romantic feeling. Notorious for his volatile temper and gambling debts exceeding $200,000, Pemberton had been pressing the Cunningham family for months to formally sanction his courtship of Evangeline. What few people realized was that those debts were now owned by the Newport Compact itself, having been purchased from his original creditors as a means of securing his unconditional cooperation with the organization's activities. That evening, witnesses observed several heated exchanges between Pemberton and Heiress and Cunningham, though the substance of these conversations remained strictly private. However, James Wetherbe, the judge's son and a junior partner in the Cunningham Railroad enterprise, found himself positioned where he could overhear fragments of these discussions. According to his later testimony, Harrison Cunningham was pressing Pemberton to accept that more direct methods might be required to resolve what he termed the Evangeline situation, while Pemberton expressed anxiety about the foreign complications that such methods might generate. The foreign complications referred directly to Evangeline's extensive correspondence with European journalists and investigators who had been carefully documenting the international dimensions of American corporate corruption. Through contacts cultivated during her European education, she had built relationships with reporters from the London Times, the Paris Le Figaro, and the Berlin Tageblatt, all of whom were preparing exposés about American business practices that violated international law. The Newport Compact had already paid substantial bribes to suppress some of these stories, but Evangeline's cooperation was essential to preventing a coordinated international campaign that could result in trade sanctions and diplomatic fallout of significant proportions. As the evening unfolded, Evangeline moved through the assembled crowd with an almost feverish energy, engaging various guests in unusually prolonged conversations, many of whom later reported the unsettling sense that she was somehow testing their knowledge or measuring their loyalties. Professor Marcus Aldrich of Yale University, present as the guest of a prominent Newport family, later recalled his surprise when Evangeline approached him with detailed and probing questions about recent archaeological discoveries in Egypt. She seemed particularly preoccupied with methods of preserving documents and artifacts over extended periods. She asked specifically about waterproof containers, he would later tell authorities, and whether organic materials could survive burial in coastal soil conditions for decades, or even centuries. Dr. Sheffield, the medical examiner, found himself drawn into what he initially took for casual conversation about forensic medicine, only to realize later that it had been a thoroughly sophisticated interrogation about methods of detecting various poisons and drugs in decomposed human remains. Evangeline had demonstrated a level of knowledge about forensic techniques that far exceeded anything a society lady ought to possess, asking pointed questions about how long different substances remained detectable in human tissue and whether certain toxins could be successfully masked to resemble natural diseases. At approximately 10:30 in the evening, during the height of the festivities, Evangeline excused herself from the ballroom, explaining that she needed to retrieve a family heirloom from her private chambers to show Count von Stauffen, who had expressed interest in the history of American railroads. This was not in itself unusual behavior. The Cunninghams were well known for their impromptu displays of artworks and historical documents. What was unusual was that Evangeline specifically insisted that no servants accompany her, saying she preferred to select the items personally. What the guests did not know was that Evangeline's request to show historical documents to Count von Stauffen was in fact a coded signal they had arranged weeks in advance. The Count was no casual visitor, but a representative of European banking interests who had been investigating irregularities in American railroad financing on behalf of several German investors who suspected they were being systematically defrauded. Evangeline had been covertly supplying him with information about the Newport Compact's international operations, and her mention of retrieving documents was his prearranged cue to prepare himself for the final transfer of evidence, material that would expose the conspiracy to European authorities in full. The last confirmed sighting of Evangeline Cunningham was by James Wetherbe, who encountered her on the mansion's grand staircase at 10:45 in the evening. According to Wetherbe's detailed later testimony, Evangeline was descending rapidly, carrying what appeared to be a small leather case or portfolio, along with a larger canvas bag containing items of some bulk. When he offered to escort her back to the ballroom, she declined, saying, "There are certain truths that matter more than social propriety, James. Some secrets that simply can no longer be kept. Your father will understand soon enough what I mean." Wetherbe later recalled that Evangeline's manner was not one of fear, but of firm resolution and barely suppressed exhilaration, as if she were finally acting on something she had spent a very long time carefully planning. She had also made a cryptic remark about insurance policies that had already been activated, and added that certain letters had been posted that very afternoon that would ensure the truth survived regardless of whatever might happen to her that night. When Evangeline failed to return to the ballroom after a full hour, her mother Constance Cunningham dispatched servants to check her chambers. They found the room empty, showing clear signs of hasty departure. A window overlooking the ocean stood open, and several items of value were missing, including a substantial amount of jewelry and cash. Most mysteriously, Evangeline's private safe had been opened, not forced, but opened with the correct combination, and whatever documents it had contained were gone entirely. However, the servants also found unmistakable evidence that the room had been searched by multiple individuals after Evangeline's departure. Furniture had been shifted slightly. Hidden compartments had been located and examined. Even the floorboards bore marks of having been pried up and then carefully, deliberately replaced. This strongly suggested that whatever Evangeline had taken from her safe, other parties had known of its existence and conducted their own search for any additional materials she might have left behind. The immediate response to Evangeline's disappearance laid bare the intricate web of relationships and rivalries that defined Gilded Age Newport society, and demonstrated the sophisticated methods America's wealthiest families had refined for controlling information and managing potential scandals. Harrison Cunningham's first instinct was narrative control. He immediately retained private investigators from the Pinkerton Detective Agency rather than relying solely on local law enforcement, a decision that would later prove pivotal, as it allowed the family to suppress evidence that might otherwise have led to a far swifter resolution of the case, while simultaneously revealing just how thoroughly local authorities had already been compromised by corporate influence. The Pinkerton agents, led by Detective Captain William Harrington, launched their inquiry by examining Evangeline's personal effects and conducting interviews with the mansion's staff. What they uncovered described a young woman who had been living a life far more complex and dangerous than anyone had imagined. Hidden compartments built into her writing desk yielded correspondence with lawyers, bankers, federal investigators, and what appeared to be private detectives operating as far afield as Chicago, San Francisco, London, and Paris. These letters discussed irregularities in railroad contracts, falsified safety inspections, the systematic bribery of federal officials, and, most disturbing of all, the coordinated elimination of inconvenient witnesses. Captain Harrington, a man with 2 decades of experience investigating corporate crimes, later wrote in his private notes that Evangeline's documentary collection was the most comprehensive evidence of systematic corruption he had ever encountered in his entire career. Her files contained not merely accusations and suspicions, but actual copies of forged documents, photographs taken at secret meetings, and what appeared to be meticulously detailed financial records tracing the flow of bribe money through various shell companies and foreign bank accounts. Even more disturbing were the exhaustive private notes Evangeline had compiled on the personal lives and business activities of Newport's most prominent families. A private journal, written in cipher that took Pinkerton agents 3 full weeks to decode with the assistance of cryptography experts from the Treasury Department, contained damaging material about extramarital affairs, business frauds, political corruption, and what appeared to be a formally organized conspiracy among several railroad companies to fix prices, crush competition, and suppress safety investigations. One entry, dated just 2 days before her disappearance, read, "The Pemberton contracts are fraudulent. I now possess documentary proof that the steel used in the Baltimore Bridge construction was deliberately substituted with substandard materials to inflate profit margins. TP personally sanctioned the substitution, knowing that structural failure was virtually certain. The original engineering specifications called for grade A steel throughout, but the delivered materials were grade C, supplied with falsified certificates. The engineering consultant who identified the substitution, Robert Henley, perished in a hotel fire 3 days after submitting his report. His replacement, Dr. Marcus Webb, accepted $50,000 to certify the inferior materials as acceptable. The Baltimore Bridge referenced in Evangeline's notes had collapsed 6 months earlier during the morning rush hour, killing 17 workers and injuring dozens more. The official investigation had attributed the disaster to an unexpected ice storm that had placed unanticipated stress on the structure, but Evangeline's documents pointed toward a far more sinister explanation. If her allegations were accurate, Theodore Pemberton and potentially other members of Newport society were guilty of premeditated murder camouflaged as corporate negligence. As Captain Harrington's investigation gathered momentum, he began to identify a recurring pattern of suspicious accidents and mysterious deaths connected to the business enterprises controlled by Newport's elite. In the preceding 5 years alone, at least 18 individuals involved in investigating railroad safety violations, steel quality issues, financial irregularities, or labor organizing had died under circumstances that, while individually plausible, formed a statistically impossible pattern when examined collectively. The most troubling case centered on David Cavendish, a federal railway inspector who had been probing safety violations on the Baltimore and Newport line just 18 months before Evangeline's disappearance. Cavendish had been discovered dead in his Baltimore hotel room, apparently felled by a heart attack. His widow, however, maintained firmly that her husband had been in perfect health and had recently passed the comprehensive medical examination required for his federal position. More significantly, she disclosed that her husband had been receiving threatening letters for weeks before his death and had recently taken out a substantial life insurance policy after confiding to her that he had uncovered evidence of a conspiracy reaching into the very highest levels of government and business. Mrs. Cavendish had attempted to deliver her husband's investigation files to federal authorities, only to find that the documents had vanished from their home during the funeral, apparently removed by individuals who had entered without forcing any locks or windows. When she contacted the Cunningham family directly, seeking answers about her husband's death and requesting access to railroad safety records that might support his findings, she received a visit from two impeccably dressed men who identified themselves as representatives of interests concerned with preventing the spread of malicious rumors. The visitors had issued no explicit threats, but had made their message unmistakably clear. Her husband's investigation had rested on misunderstandings and incomplete information that could carry unfortunate legal consequences if she persisted in making accusations against respected business leaders. They also pointed out that her husband's federal pension could be jeopardized if his final investigation were deemed to have been conducted improperly, and that her own position as a schoolteacher might be affected if local authorities received reports about her unstable mental state in the wake of his death. Shortly after this visit, Mrs. Cavendish received a substantial anonymous payment accompanied by a note strongly suggesting that she would be wise to abandon her inquiries and relocate to a different city where she could begin again, unburdened by painful memories. She had complied, moving to Oregon and never speaking publicly about her husband's death again, though not before secretly providing copies of his remaining investigation notes to a journalist friend who had pledged to carry the inquiry forward. That journalist, Michael O'Connor of the Baltimore Sun, had launched his own investigation into railroad safety violations, only to find his efforts systematically obstructed by officials who claimed that relevant documents had been misfiled or destroyed in routine housekeeping. When O'Connor attempted to interview other federal inspectors, he discovered that several had been transferred to remote postings, while others had been promoted to positions that conveniently stripped them of access to operational safety data. O'Connor's investigation further revealed that the pattern of inspector deaths extended well beyond the Cavendish case. In the preceding 3 years, 7 federal inspectors working on railroad safety matters had died under circumstances that, while individually credible, formed a statistically impossible pattern when examined together. 3 had suffered heart attacks despite no prior history of cardiac problems. 2 had died in hotel fires that also destroyed their investigation materials. 1 had drowned under conditions suggesting he had been drugged before entering the water. And 1 had been killed in what appeared to be a random robbery, occurring just days before he was due to testify before a congressional committee about safety violations. The most chilling discovery buried within Evangeline's files was a document that appeared to be a price list for services rendered by what was called the Newport Adjustment Bureau. Written in code, but with a key that Evangeline had apparently succeeded in breaking, the document listed fees for permanent solutions to persistent problems, accidental resolution of inconvenient situations, and comprehensive reputation management services. Prices ranged from $5,000 for straightforward intimidation to $50,000 for permanent elimination with complete documentary cleanup. Captain Harrington's investigation of this document led him to conclude that the Newport Adjustment Bureau was an entirely real organization, operating out of offices in New York, Chicago, and San Francisco under the guise of providing discreet consulting services to industrial concerns. When Harrington moved to investigate the organization directly, however, he found its offices shuttered, its staff vanished, and its business records purged from every official repository. 3 weeks after Evangeline's disappearance, Captain Harrington made a discovery that would fundamentally redirect the investigation and reveal the true scope of the conspiracy she had been documenting. While examining the grounds of Windward Hall with greater care, drawing on tracking techniques he had mastered during his military service, he noticed that the soil in one particular section of the estate's sprawling gardens showed unmistakable signs of recent disturbance. The area lay near the mansion's conservatory, close to where Evangeline had reportedly been observed speaking with Theodore Pemberton earlier in the evening, yet positioned so that it could be seen from several of the mansion's windows, suggesting that whoever had disturbed the soil had acted with either extraordinary boldness or absolute confidence they would not be interrupted. Employing specialized excavation methods just beginning to find their way into criminal investigations, Harrington and his team carefully worked the site. What they unearthed was not Evangeline's body, but something equally significant, and far more dangerous to the perpetrators. A waterproof metal container buried approximately 4 feet underground, wrapped in oiled canvas and sealed with wax against moisture damage. Inside were copies of the documents that had disappeared from Evangeline's safe, along with additional materials that painted an even more damning portrait of corruption among Newport's elite and exposed the international reach of their criminal enterprise. The buried archive contained detailed financial records documenting systematic embezzlement from the Baltimore and Newport Railroad's Worker Pension Fund, forged safety inspection certificates for at least 12 major construction projects across the Northeast, evidence of bribery involving federal officials, judges, and local politicians, and, most shocking of all, detailed correspondence with European criminal organizations that specialized in what the documents euphemistically termed industrial problem resolution. According to Evangeline's documentation, what she had labeled the Newport Compact was not merely a domestic business conspiracy, but an American branch of a vast international network of wealthy families who had been coordinating their activities across national borders since the 1870s. The compact encompassed the Cunninghams, the Pembertons, and 5 other American families, while also maintaining formal relationships with parallel organizations in England, Germany, France, and even Russia. These international connections enabled them to launder money, conceal assets, eliminate troublesome individuals across multiple countries, and manipulate commodity markets on a genuinely global scale. The most detailed document in the archive was a comprehensive organizational chart laying out the full structure of the Newport Compact's operations. At its apex sat the 7 American families, each commanding a specific industrial sector: railroads, steel production, coal mining, shipping, banking, textiles, and agricultural commodities. Beneath them spread dozens of subsidiary organizations, private detective agencies, legal firms, medical practices, newspaper companies, and what appeared to be several funeral establishments specializing in discreet body disposal. One particularly disturbing section of the archive documented what Evangeline had termed the American Death List, a comprehensive record of individuals eliminated by the Newport Compact since its founding in 1877. The list encompassed federal investigators, journalists, labor organizers, business competitors, and even family members who had threatened to expose the organization's activities. Each entry recorded the person's name, occupation, the specific threat they represented, the method employed to eliminate them, and the cost of the operation. The death list revealed that the Newport Compact had been responsible for at least 43 murders over 16 years, employing methods ranging from poisoning and staged accidents to what appeared to be contract assassinations disguised as random crimes. The victims included not only American citizens but also several Europeans who had been investigating American business practices on behalf of their governments. Among the most shocking entries was the death of Congressman William Hayes of Ohio, who had been leading a congressional inquiry into railroad safety violations. Hayes had died in 1891 of what was officially recorded as a heart attack, but the archive revealed that he had been poisoned with a substance designed to mimic cardiac failure, administered during a dinner at the Union Club in Washington attended by several Newport Compact members. Another entry documented the elimination of Sarah Mitchell, a journalist for the Chicago Tribune investigating connections between industrial accidents and political corruption. Mitchell had died in a hotel fire that consumed both her life and her investigation files. The archive revealed that the fire had been deliberately ignited using a new type of accelerant that burned with such speed and completeness that it left no detectable trace of arson, and that Mitchell had been drugged before the fire was set to ensure she could not escape. Perhaps the single most chilling discovery in the archive was a document that appeared to be Evangeline's own death warrant, written in the hand of Judge Cornelius Weatherben, countersigned by Theodore Pemberton and Harrison Cunningham himself. Dated 3 days before the summer's end ball, it read, "The EC situation has become untenable. Foreign complications require immediate resolution. Recommend permanent solution with careful attention to documentary cleanup. Suggest maritime disposal to prevent forensic complications. Authorization granted for expenditure up to $75,000 for comprehensive resolution." Attached to this document was a detailed operational plan for Evangeline's murder, including the method to be employed, a drug inducing apparent heart failure, the location where her body would be disposed of, weighted and dropped into deep ocean water from a private yacht, and the cover story to be presented to authorities and press alike. She had eloped with a secret lover to Europe, where she had subsequently died in a tragic accident abroad. The plan also incorporated provisions for neutralizing witnesses who might complicate the cover story, with Margaret Flynn and Patrick O'Brien specifically identified as individuals requiring management. The document noted that Flynn could be discredited by spreading rumors about her mental instability and drinking, while O'Brien could be reassigned, or, if necessary, eliminated in a manner consistent with a workplace accident. Captain Harrington's discovery of this archive created an immediate crisis for his investigation. On the one hand, he now held comprehensive evidence of a criminal conspiracy penetrating the highest reaches of American business and government. On the other hand, he understood clearly that his own life was now in serious danger, the archive having made plain that the Newport Compact possessed extensive resources for eliminating threats, and had already demonstrated a consistent willingness to kill federal investigators. His concerns proved well-founded. Within days of uncovering the archive, Harrington began experiencing pressure from unexpected quarters. His superiors at the Pinkerton Agency suggested he was pursuing unproductive lines of inquiry and recommended refocusing his efforts on the theory that Evangeline had simply fled with a secret lover. When Harrington refused to abandon his investigation, pointing out that the evidence clearly indicated a murder conspiracy, he was informed that the Cunningham family had filed a complaint about his harassment of their associates and had formally requested his removal from the case. More ominously, Harrington began to receive subtle but unmistakable warnings. His hotel room was searched while he was out conducting interviews, nothing stolen, but his investigation notes clearly examined. Anonymous letters arrived suggesting that his wife and children back in Chicago might be considerably safer if he brought his investigation to a swift conclusion and returned home. Most unsettling of all, he discovered that someone had been making detailed inquiries into his personal finances, family background, and potential vulnerabilities that might be exploited if more direct methods of influence proved necessary. Recognizing that his position had become untenable, Harrington made a decision that almost certainly saved his life, while also ensuring that the truth about Evangeline's disappearance would remain hidden for decades. He secretly produced multiple copies of the archive's most critical documents, concealing them in various locations and arranging for their delivery to trusted associates should anything happen to him. He then officially closed his investigation with a report that largely supported the theory of Evangeline's voluntary flight, while privately continuing his inquiry through entirely unofficial channels. As Captain Harrington burrowed deeper into the Newport Compact through his covert investigation, he began to grasp that Evangeline's disappearance was not an isolated event, but the culmination of a systematic campaign to neutralize the most serious threat the organization had ever confronted. What made Evangeline uniquely dangerous was not merely her access to inside information about her family's business operations, but her sophisticated mastery of how to gather evidence, secure it against destruction, and coordinate with multiple investigators and journalists to ensure that revelations could never be wholly suppressed. Harrington's continuing inquiry revealed that Evangeline had been operating for at least 18 months within a network of individuals who shared her determination to expose the Newport Compact. This network included federal investigators covertly documenting corruption across various government agencies, foreign journalists probing American business practices from safely beyond the reach of domestic intimidation, and even a small number of wealthy individuals who had broken with their own families' participation in the conspiracy. The network's most significant member was Dr. Helena Ashford, a physician and social reformer who had been investigating the connection between industrial accidents and the inadequate medical care routinely provided to workers. Dr. Ashford had first become involved when she noticed that workers injured in railroad accidents were frequently treated by specific doctors who appeared far more concerned with limiting legal liability than with providing appropriate medical attention. Her investigation had uncovered that certain practitioners were receiving substantial fees to produce false diagnoses that would prevent injured workers from successfully pursuing lawsuits against railroad companies. Dr. Ashford had also discovered that certain hospitals were routinely disposing of workers' bodies without proper examination when they died from industrial injuries, often citing family requests for immediate burial on religious grounds. In reality, these bodies were being destroyed to prevent independent medical examiners from discovering evidence of criminal negligence or deliberate poisoning. Dr. Ashford's investigation had documented at least 37 cases in which workers had been buried without adequate medical examination despite clear indicators that their deaths warranted scrutiny. When Dr. Ashford had attempted to present her findings to medical authorities and government officials, she had encountered precisely the same pattern of obstruction and intimidation that other investigators before her had experienced. Medical boards declared her evidence insufficient. Government officials insisted existing regulations were adequate. Several hospitals where she had tried to conduct examinations abruptly announced that their records had been destroyed in routine housekeeping procedures. More seriously, the threats she received grew increasingly specific and personal. Anonymous letters warned her that lady doctors who interfere in matters beyond their understanding might find their medical licenses revoked, their reputations destroyed, or their personal safety compromised. When these warnings failed to halt her investigation, she found rumors being deliberately circulated about her professional competence and personal morality, clearly designed to discredit her work and isolate her from potential supporters. Dr. Ashford's connection to Evangeline had begun when the young heiress approached her with questions about detecting poisons in human remains. Evangeline had presented herself as a wealthy dilettante with an amateur interest in forensic medicine, but Dr. Ashford quickly concluded that her visitor possessed sophisticated knowledge about criminal investigation and was seeking specific practical information for clearly defined purposes. Over several months, the two women had forged a genuinely collaborative partnership, with Dr. Ashford supplying medical expertise while Evangeline contributed financial resources and access to business intelligence. Their alliance had proven remarkably effective, enabling them to document the full scope of the Newport Compact's activities with a level of detail and scientific rigor that no individual investigator could have achieved working alone. Dr. Ashford's medical knowledge allowed her to identify patterns of suspicious deaths that might otherwise have gone undetected, while Evangeline's business connections gave her the means to trace financial relationships and map the flow of bribe money through corporate structures. Their collaboration, however, had simultaneously made both women extraordinarily dangerous to the Newport Compact, which had responded with increasingly refined efforts to neutralize their work. Dr. Ashford discovered that medical colleagues were being pressured to shun her. Patients were being cautioned that she was mentally unstable. Hospitals were being warned that employing her might cost them funding from wealthy philanthropists. And more ominously still, Dr. Ashford began to experience incidents suggesting her personal safety was directly under threat. Her home was burglarized twice, no valuables taken, but her medical records and investigation files carefully scrutinized. She received anonymous letters containing detailed information about her daily routine, making plain that she was under active surveillance. And most disturbingly, she discovered that someone had attempted to tamper with her medical supplies, substituting dangerous substances for legitimate medications in a manner that could easily have resulted in the accidental poisoning of her patients. As pressure on both women intensified, they developed increasingly sophisticated methods for protecting their investigation and ensuring their evidence would survive even their own elimination. Evangeline established the network of safety deposit boxes and foreign contacts that Captain Harrington would eventually discover, while Dr. Ashford constructed her own system of hidden archives and automatic disclosure procedures. But their most consequential innovation was what they termed the insurance policy, a comprehensive document that not only detailed the Newport Compact's criminal activities in full, but provided evidence of the organization's systematic efforts to suppress investigation and eliminate witnesses. This document was deliberately designed to be so damaging and comprehensive in scope that its release would inevitably trigger federal investigations, international diplomatic consequences, and criminal prosecutions impossible to smother through bribery or intimidation. The insurance policy contained not only documentation of past crimes, but evidence of ongoing criminal activities and detailed predictions about future actions the Newport Compact was planning. This predictive element was crucial. It meant that if Evangeline and Dr. Ashford were eliminated, the subsequent fulfillment of their predictions would serve as compelling independent corroboration that their other allegations were equally well-founded. On the evening of the summer's end ball, Evangeline had carried a copy of the insurance policy in the leather case that James Weatherb had observed her descending the mansion staircase with. Her plan was to present this document to the assembled Newport Compact members and demand that they confess their crimes and make restitution to their victims. Should they refuse, she would activate the automatic disclosure procedures that would simultaneously release the document to multiple newspapers, federal prosecutors, and foreign governments. What Evangeline had failed to anticipate was that the Newport Compact had developed their own intelligence network, one that had been monitoring her activities closely and had uncovered at least a portion of her preparations. While they did not know the full extent of her evidence or the precise mechanics of her disclosure procedures, they had learned enough to conclude that she represented an existential threat to their organization. This intelligence had driven the decision, recorded in Judge Weatherby's signed authorization, to eliminate her permanently rather than attempting any further negotiation or intimidation. The confrontation that unfolded in Evangeline's chambers on the night of August 14 was no spontaneous eruption, but a meticulously planned operation involving not only Theodore Pemberton and Judge Weatherby, but several additional Newport Compact members who had positioned themselves strategically throughout the mansion to ensure the operation could be carried out without interference. Before that confrontation took place, however, Harrington's investigation revealed that Evangeline had succeeded in completing one final act of defiance, one that would ultimately secure a posthumous victory over the Newport Compact. At some point during the evening, she had managed to activate at least some of her disclosure procedures, dispatching coded telegrams to her network of allies and setting in motion a chain of events that would eventually bring the organization's crimes into full public view. Just when we thought we'd seen everything, the horror unfolding in Newport only deepens. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit the like button to support our work, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this one. Let's uncover together what happens next in this tale of Gilded Age corruption and murder. The truth about Evangeline Cunningham's final hours began to surface through an extraordinary convergence of evidence that Captain Harrington would not fully assemble until months after the official investigation had been shuttered. The breakthrough came when Margaret Flynn, Evangeline's personal maid, finally summoned the courage to provide a complete account of what she had witnessed on the night of August 14, 1893. Flynn's testimony, corroborated by physical evidence and documentary materials Evangeline had managed to preserve, revealed a confrontation of stunning brutality, one that demonstrated the lengths to which America's wealthiest families were prepared to go in defending their criminal empire. According to Flynn's detailed account, the confrontation in Evangeline's chambers had indeed taken place, but not as a spontaneous argument that escalated beyond control. It was a carefully choreographed operation involving extensive preparation and the participation of individuals who had clearly planned and rehearsed every step. Flynn reported observing unusual activity throughout the mansion that evening, with several guests making repeated trips to what appeared to be a temporary command center established in Harrison Cunningham's private study. At approximately 11:15 in the evening, not 11:30 as she had initially reported, Flynn heard voices coming from Evangeline's chambers. Rather than simply listening through the keyhole, she had made use of a network of servant passages that allowed her to observe the confrontation from a concealed position, offering a clear view of most of the room. What she witnessed was not a heated argument, but a methodical interrogation designed to extract information about Evangeline's evidence and her disclosure procedures. The participants included not only Theodore Pemberton, Judge Weatherby, and Harrison Cunningham, but also Dr. Edmund Sheffield, the state medical examiner, and two other men whom Flynn did not recognize, men who appeared to be professional criminals rather than members of Newport society, evidently present to provide specialized expertise in what Flynn carefully described as physical persuasion techniques. The interrogation began with Judge Weatherby presenting Evangeline with what he claimed was a legal document requiring her to surrender all evidence in her possession and submit to psychiatric evaluation for what he termed delusions and paranoid fantasies. When Evangeline refused to sign, Dr. Sheffield produced a medical bag containing what he described as therapeutic treatments that will help clarify your thinking about these unfortunate misunderstandings. Evangeline's response demonstrated both her courage and her sophisticated understanding of the legal and medical systems being deployed against her. She informed her captors that she had consulted legal experts about precisely such coercive tactics and fully understood that any confessions or surrenders of evidence obtained through force or medical coercion would be inadmissible in any court. More critically, she revealed that she had anticipated exactly this type of confrontation and had already set in motion legal and journalistic procedures ensuring the truth would emerge regardless of what was done to her. At this point, according to Flynn's testimony, the tone of the confrontation shifted dramatically. Judge Weatherby abandoned any pretense of legal process and began to describe in graphic and clinical detail what would befall Evangeline if she chose not to cooperate voluntarily. He explained that the Newport Compact had developed sophisticated methods for eliminating inconvenient individuals leaving no trace of foul play, and that they had employed these methods successfully against dozens of people who had previously threatened their interests. Theodore Pemberton augmented the judge's threats with intimate, detailed descriptions of what had become of specific individuals who had previously attempted to expose the Newport Compact. He described the death of Congressman Hayes in Washington, the elimination of journalist Sarah Mitchell in Chicago, and several other cases that Flynn recognized from newspaper accounts she had read. Pemberton's knowledge of these events was so granular and intimate that it was evident he had been personally involved in planning and executing these murders. Evangeline's response, however, visibly unnerved her interrogators and made plain that she had understood far more about their organization than they had realized. She informed them that she had spent months documenting their specific involvement in each of these cases and had already placed detailed evidence about every murder in the hands of her network of investigators and journalists. She further revealed that she possessed evidence of their international connections, including correspondence with European criminal organizations and documentation of murders committed on foreign soil. Most significantly, Evangeline disclosed that she held evidence concerning what she termed the Philadelphia incident, a deliberate train derailment that had killed more than 40 passengers and been officially attributed to mechanical failure. According to her evidence, the derailment had been purposefully engineered to eliminate a group of European investors who had been investigating irregularities in American railroad financing. The investors had been traveling together on a single train, making them a convenient target for what would appear to the world as a tragic accident. The revelation regarding the Philadelphia incident produced what Flynn described as a moment of absolute silence, as the interrogators absorbed the realization that Evangeline possessed evidence of their most carefully concealed crime. This particular act had involved not only multiple murders but also the destruction of property belonging to foreign governments, creating the potential for international diplomatic crises and criminal prosecutions beyond the reach of domestic corruption to contain. At this juncture, Dr. Sheffield produced a syringe containing what he described as a preparation that will provide immediate relief from these unfortunate delusions. Evangeline, however, had anticipated this possibility as well, having consumed a substance beforehand intended to counteract most common poisons and drugs, and having positioned various items around her room that could serve as improvised weapons if physical force became necessary. The final confrontation began when Evangeline made her move toward the window that led to her prepared emergency escape route. She had readied this route months in advance, installing a rope ladder that would allow her to descend to a boat she had concealed among the rocks below the mansion. The two professional criminals, however, had anticipated this possibility and had positioned themselves specifically to cut off her escape. According to Flynn's testimony, what followed was a brief but violent struggle during which Evangeline managed to fight off her attackers long enough to hurl the leather case containing her most critical evidence out through the window, hoping it would either be carried out to sea or recovered by allies she had stationed in boats offshore. She was ultimately overwhelmed by superior numbers and injected with Dr. Sheffield's therapeutic preparation. The drug did not kill Evangeline immediately, but induced a state of complete paralysis, leaving her conscious yet utterly unable to move or speak. In this condition, she was forced to lie still and listen as her captors methodically discussed how they would dispose of her body and erase all evidence of their involvement in her disappearance. Judge Weatherby explained that they would wait for the drug to fully take hold, then transport her body to a boat waiting in a secluded cove several miles from the mansion. The vessel would carry her far out to sea, where her body would be weighted and dropped into water deep enough to prevent any recovery, even if the location were somehow discovered. Her personal effects would be scattered across various locations to sustain the appearance of a voluntary departure, while forged documents would be produced to support the cover story of her death in a tragic European accident following a secret elopement. Yet even as she lay paralyzed and helpless, Evangeline managed to secure one final, quiet victory over her murderers. Flynn observed that she wore a special ring containing a hidden compartment, and that she somehow activated a mechanism releasing a small quantity of chemical powder into the air. This powder had been formulated to react with specific substances and produce a distinctive scent detectable for several days, even after cleaning attempts. More critically, Flynn realized the powder had been designed to adhere to clothing and skin, meaning that everyone present during its release would carry chemical traces on their persons for weeks afterward. Should investigators sophisticated enough to detect and analyze such traces ever examine those individuals, they would find evidence capable of identifying Evangeline's murderers. Flynn's final observation was perhaps the most revealing for understanding the true scope of the Newport Compact's criminal enterprise. As the drug's effects overtook Evangeline, Judge Weatherby placed a telephone call using the private line in her room. Flynn could hear only his side of the conversation, but it was unmistakably clear that he was reporting the operation's success to someone not present in the mansion. The conversation included references to the Chicago situation and the London complications, suggesting that the Newport Compact was simultaneously running parallel operations in multiple cities. Flynn heard the judge say, "The primary asset has been secured and the documentation issue has been contained. Recommend proceeding with Phase 2 of the containment protocol. The international complications should be resolved within 72 hours." This exchange confirmed that Evangeline's murder was one component of a larger, coordinated operation designed to neutralize multiple threats to the Newport Compact simultaneously. The organization had apparently identified several individuals in different locations who possessed dangerous evidence and had synchronized their elimination to prevent any surviving witnesses from assembling a complete picture of the conspiracy's full scope. The ultimate resolution of the Evangeline Cunningham case illuminated both the extraordinary sophistication of the Newport Compact's criminal machinery and the remarkable effectiveness of the countermeasures Evangeline had developed to ensure her evidence would outlast her murder. While her killers succeeded in ending her life, they failed entirely to prevent the disclosure of her evidence, an outcome that ultimately destroyed their organization, even as it allowed most of the individual participants to escape meaningful legal punishment. The first decisive breakthrough in exposing the Newport Compact arrived exactly 10 days after Evangeline's disappearance, when journalists at the New York World, the Boston Herald, and the Philadelphia Inquirer simultaneously received packages containing comprehensive documentation of the organization's criminal activities. These packages had been dispatched from multiple post offices across New England through a system Evangeline had designed to ensure that even if some deliveries were intercepted, sufficient evidence would reach its intended recipients to guarantee exposure. The packages contained not only copies of the Newport Compact's internal documents, but the detailed analytical work Evangeline had prepared alongside Dr. Ashford and other collaborators. These analyses demonstrated connections between apparently unrelated deaths, explained the mechanisms by which government officials and medical examiners had been corrupted, and provided a complete organizational chart revealing the conspiracy's full architecture. Most powerfully, the packages contained predictions about specific actions the Newport Compact would take in response to Evangeline's disappearance. These predictions proved remarkably and precisely accurate, and as the organization's efforts to suppress the investigation and eliminate witnesses unfolded exactly as Evangeline had foreseen, they provided compelling independent evidence that her other allegations were equally well-grounded. The newspaper investigations that followed generated enormous public outrage and political pressure that even the Newport Compact's formidable corruption network could not entirely contain. Federal prosecutors were compelled to open investigations. Congressional committees demanded hearings. International diplomatic pressure mounted as European governments concluded that their citizens had been murdered by American business interests. Yet the legal consequences for individual Newport Compact members proved surprisingly meager, a striking demonstration of the degree to which wealth and political influence could shield the guilty from prosecution even when their crimes had been extensively documented and publicly revealed. Harrison Cunningham died of what was officially reported as a heart attack just 2 weeks after the first newspaper stories appeared, though the rapid onset of his symptoms and the circumstances of his death were entirely consistent with poisoning. His death eliminated the prosecution's most valuable potential witness and severely impaired efforts to pursue charges against other organization members. Theodore Pemberton fled to Argentina just days before federal marshals arrived to effect his arrest, availing himself of financial resources and transportation networks the Newport Compact had established for precisely such emergencies. He lived under an assumed name on a remote estate until his death in 1923, never returning to American soil, yet continuing to coordinate with other organization members through encrypted correspondence and covert financial transfers. Judge Weatherb was quietly removed from the bench and retired to a private estate in California, ostensibly for health reasons, in reality as part of a negotiated arrangement permitting him to avoid prosecution in exchange for providing limited information about the organization's judicial corruption activities. The information he provided was, of course, carefully selected to shield the most important participants while sacrificing lower-level associates who had become liabilities. Dr. Sheffield, the medical examiner, took his own life rather than face prosecution, but not before destroying extensive records that would have provided evidence of his role in concealing numerous murders. His death was itself suspicious, he was found in his office with a gunshot wound that could credibly have been either self-inflicted or administered by someone intent on preventing him from disclosing further information about other organization members. Of the 7 families identified as Newport Compact members, only 2 faced serious legal consequences, and even these were confined to financial penalties and social ostracism rather than criminal prosecution. 3 of the family patriarchs died under suspicious circumstances within months of the revelations, apparently claimed by the very elimination methods they had routinely deployed against their own enemies. The remaining families deployed their wealth and political connections to avoid prosecution, though their reputations suffered permanent and severe damage, and their business operations were substantially disrupted. The most tragic dimension of the case was the systematic elimination of witnesses and potential informants that followed the public revelations. Margaret Flynn, whose testimony had proven crucial to understanding Evangeline's fate, disappeared shortly after providing her statement to investigators. She was reportedly observed boarding a train to Chicago, carrying a suitcase and what appeared to be a substantial quantity of cash, but no further trace of her was ever found despite extensive searches conducted by law enforcement and private investigators alike. Patrick O'Brien, the night watchman whose observations had corroborated Flynn's testimony, died in what was ruled an accidental drowning 3 months after the investigation formally concluded. The circumstances of his death: he was found in a mill pond despite being an experienced swimmer with no discernible reason to be in that location, strongly suggested murder designed to foreclose any additional testimony. Dr. Helena Ashford, who had been Evangeline's primary collaborator in documenting the Newport Compact's operations, survived longer than most witnesses before being eliminated in a manner that showcased the organization's clinical sophistication. She died in what appeared to be a laboratory accident, overcome by chemical fumes while conducting research. Investigation of the incident, however, revealed that her laboratory's ventilation system had been deliberately sabotaged in a manner requiring extensive technical knowledge and meticulous planning. The elimination of witnesses continued for years after the initial revelations, creating a pattern of deaths that was plainly deliberate yet sufficiently distributed across time and geography to avoid drawing attention from law enforcement agencies not specifically examining the connections. In total, at least 15 individuals who had contributed evidence or assistance to the Evangeline Cunningham investigation died under suspicious circumstances between 1893 and 1897. Yet the most significant and enduring consequence of the case was the gradual transformation of investigative journalism and federal law enforcement that Evangeline's pioneering methods helped set in motion. Her techniques for gathering evidence, securing it against destruction, and coordinating with multiple investigators and journalists became standard practice for reporters pursuing investigations into powerful interests. Several prominent journalists of the early 20th century cited the Newport Compact exposé as the defining inspiration for their entry into the profession and credited Evangeline's methods with making their own investigations possible. Federal government agencies also began developing far more sophisticated approaches to investigating corporate crimes and political corruption, partly in direct response to the evidence that the Newport Compact had operated for over 15 years without detection while committing dozens of murders and stealing millions of dollars. New agencies were established with specialized expertise in financial crimes, interstate criminal conspiracies, and the corruption of public officials. Perhaps most significantly, the international diplomatic fallout from the case drove the development of new treaties and agreements designed to prevent American corporations from committing crimes against foreign nationals with impunity. Several countries established dedicated investigative units to monitor American business activities within their borders, and international cooperation in criminal investigations was substantially strengthened as a result. The Cunningham fortune was eventually inherited by distant relatives who had no connection whatsoever to the railroad business and no knowledge of the Newport Compact's activities. These relatives liquidated most of the family's business interests and directed the proceeds toward the establishment of charitable foundations focused on worker safety and industrial accident prevention, a fitting memorial to the 17 workers killed in the Baltimore Bridge collapse and the many other victims of corporate negligence. Windward Hall, the mansion where Evangeline had been murdered, was sold and converted into a luxury hotel, though the business struggled persistently due to reports of unexplained phenomena in the rooms that had once served as Evangeline's private chambers. Guests reported hearing voices within the walls, finding documents that vanished when examined closely, and experiencing vivid dreams that seemed to contain detailed information about historical events they had no conceivable way of knowing. The mansion was eventually demolished in 1932 following a suspicious fire that consumed most of the structure, including the room where Evangeline had died. The leather case Evangeline had hurled from her window during her final struggle was never officially recovered, despite extensive searches of the coastline and ocean floor. Persistent rumors, however, hold that it was in fact discovered by local fishermen who grasped its significance and secretly delivered it to federal investigators. According to these accounts, the case contained evidence of even more sweeping corruption, possibly implicating federal politicians, Supreme Court justices, and international business conspiracies extending far beyond the Newport Compact's American operations. Some historians believe this additional evidence was suppressed by federal authorities who concluded that its public revelation would cause such extensive political and economic disruption as to threaten the stability of the American government itself. According to this theory, certain officials made a calculated decision to prosecute lower-level compact participants while shielding higher-level figures whose exposure would have generated an unmanageable political crisis. The most enduring mystery surrounding the case concerns the ultimate fate of what Evangeline had termed the insurance policy, the comprehensive document detailing not only past crimes but predicting the Newport Compact's future activities with startling precision. While portions of this document were clearly included in the materials that reached newspapers and prosecutors, there are clear indications that additional sections existed that were never publicly disclosed. Contemporary observers noted that several specific predictions included in the revealed portions of the insurance policy were fulfilled with remarkable accuracy in the years following Evangeline's death, but other predictions referenced in private correspondence were never released to the public. This strongly suggests that certain portions of the document may have been suppressed by authorities who recognized that their revelation would carry consequences reaching far beyond the prosecution of Newport Compact members. In the end, Evangeline Cunningham's story stands as both an inspiration and a sobering warning about the possibilities and the limitations of individual courage when confronting systematic corruption. Her sophisticated grasp of criminal investigation techniques, her capacity to build and sustain networks of allies and collaborators, and her meticulous preparation of evidence preservation and disclosure procedures enabled her to achieve a posthumous victory over her murderers that would have been impossible for a less resourceful or less determined individual. Yet her story also lays bare the brutal effectiveness of organized wealth and power in protecting itself through violence and intimidation. Even though her evidence ultimately exposed the Newport Compact's activities and led to the destruction of their organization, most of the individual participants escaped serious punishment and continue to enjoy comfortable lives sustained by wealth accumulated through murder and theft. Perhaps the most important lesson the Evangeline Cunningham case holds for us is that the struggle between justice and corruption is not a single battle to be won or lost decisively, but an ongoing conflict demanding constant vigilance and courage from individuals willing to risk their personal safety for something larger than themselves. Evangeline's sacrifice contributed to real improvements in worker safety, government accountability, and journalistic independence that benefited millions of people. But the fundamental systems that had allowed the Newport Compact to thrive, the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a small and unaccountable elite, remained largely intact. This mystery reminds us that even in the face of overwhelming corruption and violence, individual conscience and courage genuinely matter. The truth has a way of surviving even when powerful forces move to bury it beneath mountains of money, influence, and intimidation. Evangeline Cunningham's evidence outlasted her murder and ultimately achieved the justice she had sought, though at a cost that reveals, with terrible clarity, the true price of challenging entrenched power. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything has been revealed, or might there be more secrets still buried deep within the archives of America's wealthiest families? The investigative techniques that Evangeline pioneered are still employed by journalists and law enforcement agencies today, suggesting that her legacy continues to threaten those who would use wealth and power to exploit and harm others. Leave your thoughts below about what you believe really happened to that missing leather case, and whether similar conspiracies might still be operating in the present day. If you enjoyed this story and want more historical mysteries like it, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who loves dark chapters from America's past. See you in the next video.